Hey there, this is Andrew, and I'd like to welcome you to the first Gray Fox Latin Teacher podcast. Today, our topic is conversational Latin in the classroom. I'm here with Kostas, and I guess,
Hi.
First off, hi. What do you think about conversational Latin in the classroom?
Conversational Latin is something that I have found that is very much a help to students in terms of how they learn Latin and how they ultimately perform in classes and on standardized tests. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, well, how is this possible? Why is that? How do these things work? And so,
Yeah, I'm wondering that. I mean, how in the world does speaking Latin help you on tests that are really about translating Latin? I mean, those are two totally different things, right, Kostas?
well, one might think that. However, such is not the case because, and this really sort of this brings us back to this idea that somehow conversational Latin is this revolutionary idea that is sort of blazing new trail ground or something. And in fact, it's more of a return to the old method of doing things, because it seems as if somewhere along the way, let's say most of the 20th century, we sort of developed this very rigid, pigeonholed way of teaching Latin to people, wherein all that you did was read words off of a page and try and translate words like that, and sort of you have this artificial state of the language, which it was never meant to be, because the entire idea behind language, of course, is to be able to communicate things. And when you take away the spoken aspect of the Latin language, you are taking away a very important component of the language, or any language for that matter. It makes things far more difficult. If you try to learn a modern language the way that we, that is you and I, Andrew, and I know most people, were taught how to learn Latin, it just wouldn't work. And
Well, yeah.
no, go
I mean,
ahead. Absolutely.
I just want to say this sounds disturbingly theoretical to me. I mean, all right, that all sounds fine, but again, it's just theory. You can say, well, this is an important aspect of the language, but does it actually help students to perform in the way they need to perform? Because realistically, Latin teachers most of the time are in a situation where they need their students to do well on tests, to translate on tests, whether they be the in-class tests or standardized tests, like the AP Latin exam, or the National Latin exam, or the SAT Latin subject test. It's most important to, really, the school, the students, the parents, that the students do well on these tests. So anything that is extraneous to that is probably not going to be something teachers want to deal with. I mean, so again, does it get in the way, or can it in fact have a positive effect on test scores?
That's an excellent question. And I know this is something that's a major concern for Latin teachers. And I'm sure for many of you who are listening to us about how really beneficial conversational Latin can be. And Andrew, one of the points that you raised is, well, what does it really do? It's very theoretical in the way that we're speaking. But conversational Latin can be such an advantage in that it helps you understand things in a way that you could not otherwise. Just from the aspect of vocabulary, if nothing else. Retention of vocabulary is, at least I always tell my students, at least 50% of the battle. And once you're able to get your vocabulary words in order and start using language in this way, and you can start to see, even from what I'm saying here, how this can be beneficial. And I know, Andrew, this was sort of what happened with you. You've told me many times in terms of how you acquired such a diverse and broad vocabulary with Latin from having partaken of the conversational method.
Well, thank you for that compliment, Kostas. I appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.
You and I both learned Latin in what these days is called the conventional way, which is based on grammar instruction and translation, and really never speaking the language. Now, I think I was actually luckier than a lot of students in that at least my teachers made us read the language off the page. So we at least learned to pronounce it, which isn't something that's necessarily stressed all the time with students. But I took Latin in high school. I got a degree in it in college, a bachelor's degree. And I know after I got that degree, I wanted to improve. I wanted to be better. I wanted to be able to read Latin fluently, to not constantly be looking up words in the dictionary, but I couldn't get there. I didn't know how to do it because I just kept working at it in the way I'd learned to work at it, which is having the dictionary next to me every time I didn't know a word, looking it up, understanding it, then putting the sentence together, translating that sentence, and finally, in the end, understanding the sentence. But I worked on this for a number of years after college, and I didn't see myself getting any better. Around the time social media started to become a big thing, really around the time Facebook became a big thing, really that year, I got on Facebook, and the first thing I did was I joined a bunch of Latin-themed groups. And then being in those groups, I was actually able to meet some people who weren't just enthusiastic about Latin, but actually spoke Latin, or at least were trying to do it, who conversed in the Latin language. And suddenly I was in a position where I could have conversations in the Latin language. And so I did it every day. I would say the first couple months, I probably conversed in Latin for an hour a day. Well, in those 2 months, I went from somebody who had a degree in Latin, certainly, but continued to struggle with the language. I understood the grammar. I understood how it worked theoretically, but actually using it, reading it was very difficult for me. In those 2 months, I went from that to being able to read much more quickly and being able to speak the language fairly effectively just in 2 months. And the biggest thing was, in those 2 months, my vocabulary went from a very small vocabulary composed mostly of the highest frequency words in the language to a much broader vocabulary. And I'm not exaggerating. My vocabulary increased tenfold just in those 2 months. And the reason it did that was being in a position where, number one, I had to understand what somebody else was saying rapidly, and then rapidly compose a response. I was forced to come up with the vocabulary on my own. So even though I would, of course, look words up, if those words were used a number of times in succession, I was forced into coming up with those words on my own, figuring out what the correct ending was, and doing it very quickly. Mm-hmm. And when I learned that vocabulary, I knew it forever. And this was very different from what had happened before. My pattern for about 10 years before that had been look a word up, use it, translate the sentence, forget it forever, until I went back and looked it up again. And this wasn't the case with the highest frequency words, because eventually if I'd seen a word 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 times, then I had to remember it. But if it was a word that maybe I only saw a couple times a week, well, I would never learn that word. So my own experience showed me how powerful using the Latin language in a conversational context can be. But anyway, I'm getting tired of hearing myself talk about this.
Oh, no, it's very interesting. I'm sure our listeners are interested in the methodology behind this. And what you say is something that I have experienced as well in the time that I have been instructing with conversational Latin. Students have had a similar experience in that they are so much more easily able to retain their vocabulary. And of course, we were talking about, for most of this segment, what is the actual benefit here? What do you get out of it aside from just being able to speak the language? Well, you get vocabulary retention, and as a result of that, of course, it opens the door to making everything else so much easier. Everything becomes clearer. Everything becomes much more open. And when you're able to embrace every aspect of the language in that respect, then it leads to full capabilities with the language, the ability to understand what you're doing, reading, translating, anything else that you would want to do that you think that you could only achieve through the conventional method, let's say, you can do with this 100 times better because of the spoken language aspect. But I'm sure that this will naturally lead to the question of, well, how do I put this into my classroom? How do I bring it into my curriculum? And I know, Andrew, you're an expert in this.
Well, I've certainly been working on this for a while. So I don't know when you become an expert, but this is certainly something I've dealt with for many years. And my conclusions about how to do this come from personal experience. So I'm not somebody with an axe to grind here. My goal always is to figure out the best way to teach students Latin. And if they continue with it, the way to get them to fluency in the shortest time possible. What I have found is that the most effective way to teach Latin, and my conclusion about every other language has been the same, is you need to focus on two things equally. On the one hand, students need to be taught grammar and how to translate very well. They need to understand the theoretical underpinnings of the language. They have to know that. But simultaneously, they need to speak the language. These two things need to happen side by side. And the great thing is they feed into each other. I mean, you can, and certainly teachers for the last 100 years have tried very hard to separate these things. Mm-hmm. But what I found is that when you don't separate them, when you keep them side by side and you teach both of these things, you in fact are able to teach the language far more effectively and far more efficiently. I mean, yes. Kostas, what's your feeling about this?
I absolutely agree. I'm in complete agreement with you. I have found also that doing that is the best approach for the students. I think that they are best able to handle things in that regard. Now, I'm sure that our teachers out there are wondering how, a little more specifically, can I bring this into my classes? A lot of teachers I know have certain constraints, and so they worry about getting their own curriculum in, and they say, well, I don't have time for this. I don't know really even where to begin, which we'll address in a little bit, but when could I do this? And it's not as big a problem as you might think, because conversational Latin is such that it lends itself to easily being implemented within the fabric of your class, within the existing structure that you already have in place. And from having spoken to many teachers about this, we have learned that oftentimes teachers will have separate sessions at the beginnings of their class where they will devote a little bit of time to the conversation, and maybe some time after at the end of the class. But as I just mentioned, this is something that is maybe perhaps best integrated throughout the course of the lesson. And it's not as daunting as it may seem. And I know that's an adjustment for some people to sort of be going to this method of teaching, but it really is something that is just innate. It's part and parcel with the teaching of the language itself.
Well, so yeah, before I want to respond to that, before I respond to it, let's take a short break for an announcement about Gray Fox Tutors.
Thanks so much for listening to the Gray Fox Latin Teachers podcast. I'd like to talk for a minute about why you should refer your students to Gray Fox Tutors. Flexibility. Because our tutors and teachers are located in multiple time zones and all tutoring is done online, there will always be a tutor available at the time you need. Reliability. Gray, Fox, and Carmenta have been in operation since 2008, employing dozens of tutors and teachers. We will not suddenly cancel tutoring sessions just because our own midterms are coming. The best of the best. Carmenta Online only hires the best teachers and tutors, and only the best and most experienced of these are promoted to the Gray Fox division. For Latin, Ancient Greek, standardized test prep, and more, only Gray Fox gives you the tutor you need at the time you need.
Okay, we're back, and I want to talk a little bit about the specifics of integrating conversational Latin into a teacher's existing curriculum, because there are a lot of teachers out there who are interested. I know because I've spoken to many of them. I've particularly been able to talk to teachers through our conversational Latin workshops, Skype conversational Latin workshops that we have with teachers. They are able to practice conversation with us, and they are also able to learn how to teach conversational Latin. And so a lot of teachers who are involved in our workshops are implementing what they have learned, and I love to hear their feedback about this. Number one, as you said, Kostas, there are a number of different ways to do it. So you might decide, well, maybe the first 5 minutes of class is when we'll work on conversation. Maybe the end of class is when we'll work on conversation. Or maybe there will be a number of periods throughout each class when the students will work on conversation. Teachers I've spoken to have done all of these different things. And my feeling, and this comes from my experience, is that all of these are very positive. No matter what we've heard from teachers is that, it's that the students not only are learning Latin more effectively and efficiently, doing this in addition to their grammar studies, but that they love it. That their eyes light up when it's the period, the time of class, when they're actually going to converse in Latin, when the teacher is going to guide them through some conversation in Latin. Suddenly, Latin goes from something that they don't care about, that doesn't mean anything to them, that isn't any fun at all. It's like all their other classes. They have to get through it. You know, they've got to do math, they've got to do English, they've got to do Latin. Okay, well, we're waiting for 3 o'clock when the bell rings and we can get out of here.
Right.
And maybe they look forward to recess. But now there's another period of the day when they actually enjoy school. Kostas, what has your experience been with this?
Well, I'm really glad you asked this, and if I may, let me inject a personal anecdote here. So I love talking about my high school Latin teacher, who was my first Latin teacher, and this is something that I share with everyone, and I kid you not, audience, her name was Mrs. Paternoster. If there were ever a more appropriate Latin name for a Latin teacher, I couldn't think of it. So that was fate, let's call it. But anyhow, she was the greatest Latin teacher in the world, and she introduced me to conversational Latin. And we're going back 20 years now, the story I'm relating to you. This is something that just wasn't done. And this wasn't done even within the framework of the class. This was something we did on the side. So she would stand outside the classroom door as people were matriculating through the hallways. And I noticed one day one of her students walked by her. I was a little bit back in the distance. And one of her students came up there and started speaking to her in Latin, and she was answering in Latin. And I was just flabbergasted. I thought this was the most unbelievable thing I'd ever heard. And all I knew was I wanted to be a part of that. It was so interesting to me. It was so awesome, for lack of a better word. I thought, wow, listen, Latin is being spoken. This looks so tremendous. And I loved Latin anyway. I had been taking it for about a month or so before this started. I was just getting started with it, but it was very staid and very structured and in that way that we talked about before. But hearing it like that just totally opened me up. And if I thought I loved it before, I loved it even more after that. And so I started doing that. I took it upon myself to sort of seek out some materials and look into how one would go about speaking Latin if one were to do that. And just from learning the things that she was teaching us in the class, the various phrases. And I went up to her and I started having conversations with her in Latin, conversations that would go on for minutes at a time. And I can recall other students who did not know Latin or did not know anything at all, were just passing by in the hallway some days, watching the two of us stand there and have a total conversation in Latin. And they would gather, the little crowds would gather, and what are they saying? What is going on here? They're speaking Latin. What? Yeah, and so it's just one of the greatest memories that I have, and it increased my interest and my love of the language so much more exponentially than it even had been before, which is saying a lot because as I said, I loved Latin from the jump, and this just made it all the more interesting to me. And she would integrate little things throughout the class too. She'd tell us to open our books or close our notebooks or look at the board and things like this in Latin. And as I said, this was decades ago, and now there's this movement to bring conversational Latin to the forefront. And from having experienced it myself and from speaking to all these teachers, as I know we have, and seeing the results of this, I know for a fact, I am a testimony to this, that conversational Latin does work.
I could say exactly the same thing. So the two of us have had a lot of experience, not only with our own Latin educations, but with the Latin education of our students. And we have seen it work with our students as well. Now, again, this all sounds pretty vague. So, yeah, integrate Latin into your class, for certain periods in the class. A teacher might say, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, but I don't know how to do it. How do I actually do this? What is the way to get from I understand that this is something that's helpful to the students to now I understand how to actually enact this in the classroom? Right. Kostas, I know that you've got something to say about that.
Well, up until now, I think the foremost authority for teaching conversation, or not even teaching it, but just conversational Latin in general, is probably the book, of course, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, Conversational Latin for Oral Proficiency by the great John C. Troutman. And this is a great book. I actually have it on my hard drive right now in an ebook form, and I refer to it quite often. But for as great as that book is, it doesn't really show you how to implement conversational Latin into a class of yours. It's not presented in such a way, I don't think, where you could take parts of it and sort of make it into a course. It's sort of more along the lines of conversation itself, just sort of a recreational type thing, let's say, or a reference, perhaps. It's good for reference, and it's actually one of those things that I was that I had found when I was looking myself to start to develop my own conversational skills to speak with my high school teacher. But there are too many vagaries involved, and I don't think it's good enough to the point where you would be able to use it to implement your own curriculum. So that probably would leave the teacher to think, well, if only there were something that would show me step by step how to integrate conversational Latin into my classes.
Well, there is something now.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I have actually written a textbook called the Gray Fox Conversational Latin course. And this is something that I developed from a curriculum I created because there was a point when I was just teaching conversational Latin in classes myself. And then there was a point where I needed teachers of ours to teach conversational Latin classes, and I needed to communicate to them how I wanted them to do this. So I created a very specific curriculum, and that curriculum became this textbook. And we have a free download of this textbook. If you click the textbook download link that is right below where you are listening to this podcast or where you downloaded this podcast on our website, you can take a look at it, and I hope that you will. I hope that you'll at least take a look at it and see if this is something that interests you. But I know that we just put this out. We put this out less than a week ago. So we essentially published it online less than a week ago. There has already been an enormous amount of interest, and we've really only shared it with our inner circle. I mean, so in the past 4 days, there have been nearly 100 downloads of the textbook. And you know, my expectation is that over the next couple of weeks, there will be hundreds more. We'll see. But we're going to do our best to get the word out about this. And my hope is that as many Latin teachers as possible see the textbook, acquaint themselves with it, and then hopefully consider having something like this, something that actually gives them the details about how to implement conversation over a period of time, that they will really want to move forward and use it in their classes, even if they don't have very much conversational experience themselves. And I want to say the book was written for teachers who have all levels of conversational experience. So for teachers who have a lot of conversational experience, this can be great for them because it just provides a structure. It says, this is what you do in the first week, this is what you do in the second week, so on and so on and so on. This is how you build over time so that the students aren't getting overwhelmed. They're just gradually growing in their understanding and their ability in speaking the Latin language. But it's also extremely good for teachers who have little to no conversational Latin experience.
Yes.
If you just follow the textbook, you can do it. Okay, even if you've never spoken Latin before, if you follow the textbook to the letter, you will be able to teach it effectively. Because the thing is, in the end, the teacher just needs to be a tiny bit ahead of the students. As long as you're a little bit ahead of the students, it'll still work. So I want to say that I also love John Troutman's book, Conversational Latin for Oral Proficiency. It has been an extremely important reference for me because it has given me access to the idioms, the conversational idioms that one needs to know to speak Latin effectively. And that's been great, but I had to really I had to dig into that textbook and really sort of pull out what I needed from it, and it took a bit of work. And it couldn't be used as a course. And so if you need a course, I don't think it's the right textbook, but if you need a really great reference, I think it's perfect. And so I have a lot of praise for John Troutman's book. And like Kostas, I have it, a digital version in my hard drive as well. I refer to it, every once in a while. So I used to refer to it a lot, not as much anymore, but it's been very important for me. And I would actually say that any teacher who's really serious about this should use Troutman's book as a reference as well.
Absolutely. It's a terrific book. Yeah. Yes.
But anyway, I've talked too much about this book. I'm embarrassed. But I do hope that people will take the time to download it, take a look at it, and I think it can be a great help to teachers who are really serious about integrating conversational Latin into their existing curriculum. And as we said before, my feeling is that teachers may say, well, I don't have time for this. I've got things I need to accomplish. I have to get through this material by the end of the year. I have to get students to the point where they do well on the AP Latin test. That's what I have to focus on. I can't do anything else. My experience has been when students speak the language, it speeds up everything else. So they learn the grammar much more quickly. They learn vocabulary much better. And they're able to read in a much more fluent way than they could otherwise. I mean, Kostas, what's your experience of this?
That's absolutely been my experience as well. And again, from the people that we've spoken with, and this is the most important aspect, people who have done this have told us specifically these things do happen. Learning is rapidly increased. Retention is so much better than it was before the use of conversational Latin. And perhaps most importantly, and this sort of goes hand in hand with all that, interest and enjoyment is massively increased when you include the conversational Latin aspect. And, I always say, you wouldn't teach a modern language this way. And we have to get out of this thinking that says that Latin has to be taught only one way. Clearly, that's not something that's true. And conversational Latin, not only is it the wave of the future in some respects, but it's hearkening back to a time when this is how Latin was taught. And it is by far, at least in my opinion, and from those that we've spoken with, the best way to teach the Latin language.
Yeah, it's the wave of the past, isn't it? So it seems like a revolution, but in fact, what I'm certainly advocating, and I think both of us are advocating, is really just going back to a method of teaching the language that was used for many hundreds of years before the 20th century. It was only in the 20th century they decided, well, we don't need to speak Latin anymore. That's not important. And of course, right at that point, there was a very rapid decrease in the actual fluency people had in the Latin language. And I personally think that this is a big part of why Latin has been less popular recently. Yeah. As we said before, students love to speak Latin. And when you take that spoken component away, suddenly it's a language that doesn't just lose its life, but it loses a certain portion of its magic. Mm-hmm. And my feeling is, let's bring it back. Let's bring the magic back. Let's make Latin live again. Let's make it not just fun in an intellectual way, but also fun in a really visceral way.
Absolutely. So if you're as excited about conversational Latin as we are, we absolutely do encourage you all to download our Gray Fox Conversational Latin course textbook and give us some feedback. Let us know how it goes for you. Get in touch via the contact links on the Gray Fox website, and we would love to hear from you. And additionally, if you've enjoyed this podcast today, we encourage you to subscribe and stay tuned for our weekly episodes to come, as we will be talking about a lot more things of great interest to Latin teachers. And Andrew, you provided terrific perspective today. It was a pleasure speaking with you about this.
It was a pleasure for me as well.
And we will see you next time on the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. Bye, everyone.